With the overwhelming amount of information we're all exposed to on a daily basis, it can be hard to cut through all the noise and get to the heart of the issues. And I hope that this video will help people understand the context and the facts of the case against Donald Trump. To really understand how all this started, we need to go back to November 2013, when the notoriously corrupt and Russian-backed president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, rejected a deal for greater integration with the European Union. This sparked mass protests throughout Ukraine, which Yanukovych's government attempted to put down with violence. Ultimately, the Ukrainian government failed to quell the protests, and in February 2014, the government of Viktor Yanukovych fell. Unfortunately, he escaped to Russia, where he remains today. Shortly after that, Russia invaded and annexed a portion of Ukraine called Crimea. And in April 2014, pro-Russian separatists began seizing even more territory in eastern Ukraine. In the months that followed, fighting between the rebels and the Ukrainian military intensified. And as the Ukrainians began to gain the upper hand, the Russian army overtly invaded eastern Ukraine to help support the rebels. It was around this time that the United States started providing military aid to Ukraine with bipartisan support in Congress. In the midst of all this turmoil, the Ukrainian people elected Petro Poroshenko. He campaigned on a platform to push the Russians out of Ukraine, develop closer ties with Europe and the United States, and to root out the corruption that had permeated the Ukrainian government under Yanukovych. This is the context under which the United States developed our official foreign policy towards Ukraine. That policy is summarized on the State Department's website this way. The United States attaches great importance to the success of Ukraine as a free and democratic state with a flourishing market economy. U.S. policy is centered on supporting Ukraine in the face of continued Russian aggression as it advances reforms to strengthen democratic institutions, fight corruption, and promote conditions for economic growth and competition. The United States does not recognize Russia's attempted annexation of Crimea and continues to seek a diplomatic solution to the Russia-instigated conflict in eastern Ukraine. In accordance with our national policy, the U.S., its allies, and some development groups like the International Monetary Fund pushed a wide range of reforms aimed at helping Ukraine tackle its corruption problems. These reforms included things like creating an independent anti-corruption court, cleaning up the banking sector, reforming its tax system, and firing corrupt officials like former Prosecutor General Viktor Shokin. Pushing Ukraine to implement these reforms was a high priority for the U.S., and Vice President Biden was assigned to head up those efforts. It's important to note that while Mr. Biden was the administration's point person on Ukraine, it was really the brave men and women on the National Security Council and in the U.S. Foreign Service that did the heavy lifting. If you didn't watch their testimony, consider it your patriotic duty to at least watch their opening statements. As an American, I have to say I am proud and grateful for the work these people do to advance our national interests. As the Financial Times put it in October 2018, the government in Kiev can justifiably claim to have made more progress with structural reform in just 4 years than any administration since the country gained its independence in 1991. Not surprisingly though, some of the people pushing these reforms, like Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, made some very powerful enemies. Now that brings us to the landslide election of Volodymyr Zelensky in May of this past year. Mr. Zelensky was a political outsider, mostly working in television before running for president. He campaigned on a platform of accelerating anti-corruption reforms, finding a solution to the ongoing conflict with Russia, and closer political and economic ties to the West. The Ukraine experts at the State Department and on the National Security Council believed that this would be an excellent opportunity to help further our nation's goals for Ukraine. President Zelensky's margin of victory, around 70%, gave him significant political capital that he could use to push through some of the most difficult anti-corruption reforms, and a strong position from which he could negotiate with the Russians. It was decided that the United States should support President Zelensky with a White House visit to show the Russians and the Ukrainians our solidarity with the Ukrainian people. That, along with the continuation of military aid, became top priorities for our country. Unfortunately, what most of the people working to support our national interests did not know was that Donald Trump was actively undermining their efforts, and he did this in a number of ways. First, he removed a decorated veteran diplomat who had been leading the charge against corruption in Ukraine. Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch. He did so at the behest of his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, and Mr. Giuliani's Ukrainian associates, Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman. It is still unclear exactly why Mr. Giuliani and his associates were pushing so hard for Ambassador Yovanovitch's removal. It may have been simply that she was a roadblock to his planned extortion of the Ukrainian government. But this aspect of the scandal is still unfolding. Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman have since been arrested on charges that they illegally funneled money to a pro-Trump election committee. We also know that Mr. Giuliani received $500,000 in 2018 to work on behalf of a company called Fraud Guarantee, co-founded by Mr. Parnas, and that Mr. Parnas received a $1 million payment from a lawyer for Ukrainian oligarch Dmytro Firtash. Mr. Firtash is one of Ukraine's wealthiest businessmen and currently fighting extradition by U.S. authorities on bribery charges. My sense is that as investigators follow the money, the motives of these key players will become more clear. That is, unless Donald Trump is able to stop these investigations. Secondly, Donald Trump demanded that the Ukrainians announce a corruption investigation into Joe Biden and his son Hunter. Based on the testimony of Gordon Sondland, President Trump didn't even care if the investigation was actually carried out, only that it was announced publicly. In return for this favor, Donald Trump agreed to release congressionally appropriated military aid that wasn't even his to hold up. The Ukrainians, being in the middle of a war, desperately needed the aid, and President Zelensky really wanted the Oval Office visit to show his people and the Russians that the United States had his back. The Ukrainians had scheduled an interview with CNN for September 13th, but before they could go through with it, the whistleblower came forward and shed light on the whole scheme. Can you imagine if President Trump's plan had worked? Joe Biden would have been completely handicapped by the suspicion that he had done something wrong in Ukraine, and President Trump would have used the fabricated scandal in every political ad. If the president does get away with this, why wouldn't he just condition something like the next phase of the US-China trade deal on promises that they will work to undermine whoever the Democratic nominee turns out to be? Why wouldn't all future presidents use this dirty trick? My guess is if a Democratic president does this in the future, every single Republican in Congress will vote to impeach. The argument that the president has done nothing wrong is patently false. The president was not within his rights to put his own political interests, the financial interests of Rudy Giuliani, and the interests of some corrupt Ukrainians above those of the United States. It is certainly not his right to refuse to cooperate with a clearly justifiable investigation by Congress. I'm shocked that so many Republican senators who thought a president lying about sex deserved a complete and thorough congressional investigation, including witness testimony before the Senate, see nothing wrong with the Trump administration's stonewalling of Congress, and see no reason for Senate witnesses in this case. I'm angered by the number of Republicans who have publicly stated that they don't think what the president did was even wrong, or that subverting our national interests to rig an election is even an impeachable offense. No president, regardless of party, should ever be above the law and the Constitution. Yet that's the level to which Republicans have elevated Donald Trump. The Justice Department can't investigate his wrongdoing, and apparently neither can Congress. There have been a lot of embarrassing moments for the Republican Party in recent years, but the lack of courage, deliberate dishonesty, and pure partisanship on display in the United States Senate today will forever be a stain on that body. Our only hope now is to educate ourselves and our fellow citizens about what really went down. Despite what Republicans would have you believe, this is not a boring issue, and it's not too complex to understand. It's vitally important that we all pay attention to this and do our research. The future of our 243-year-old republic depends on it. I hope you will join me in swearing to never vote for a member of Congress who did not vote to impeach Donald Trump, or a United States senator who does not vote to remove him from office. May God bless and defend America.